We are in a second Cold War with China. How does America win?
Well, we win exactly the same way we did the first Cold War, and it's really it's an ideological war. It's an economic war. It's not as much a military war, although you'll see wars happening on the outskirts of it. That's what I believe the Russia-Ukraine conflict is. It's a aspect of the second Cold War. So just like we had the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and a lot of things going on in Europe during the first Cold War, you're going to see things happen maybe in Europe, but likely a lot happening in Asia. But the idea here that there's direct conflict, military conflict between the U.S. and China, or the U.S. and Russia, that's the part that I think I'm very hopeful that we'll be mindful of because of the danger of nuclear escalation and the catastrophe that could cause. I think we were, during the first Cold War, I think one of the benefits that we had was we were still, Nagasaki and Hiroshima were still pretty fresh in people's minds. And there was just a recognition of the terrible destructiveness of nuclear weapons. And I think part of the problem of, after the end of the Cold War and starting this new Cold War is we've lost a little bit of that fear. And the fear is, I think, one of the things that kept us very focused on making sure that there was no direct confrontation of the conflict. Although there was, a few times that maybe we could have slipped into conflict, I think cooler heads prevailed. What you don't see today, though, is just a recognition of how you don't have kids hiding under their desks, or you don't have people that are terrified of nuclear weapons. And they think that's a good thing. I don't think it is. I think it's actually a dangerous thing because it makes us think that, the way we compete with China is not ideological, not economic, but rather militarily. And I absolutely disagree with that.
Well, it's interesting because China never had that fear of nuclear weapons. I mean, Mao bragged that, even if a nuclear bomb was dropped, and I forget the numbers he used, but there'd still be millions of Chinese people left. We're fine. And so I wonder how Xi Jinping thinks about something like nuclear weapons with even more distance between him and Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, Mao was a unique person, but I don't think unique in the sense that the party has changed much in that. I really think they look at the Chinese people as a tool to use in what they want to do, and not necessarily that I don't consider that, for example, when we think of Taiwan, I could see the Chinese Communist Party raising the entire island and not leaving anybody surviving, if that's what they thought it would take to take the island. And I don't think that they would hesitate a minute to lose millions of Chinese people if they thought it would, get them closer to whatever their goals are. And so, I think definitely when you think about American leaders or any leaders of a free society where the citizens, still have somewhat of a choice, I don't think you're going to get the same outcomes from the Chinese Communist Party leadership as you would from leaders of those types of nations. And that's the thing, that can be very concerning because what we tend to do in national security and foreign policy is mirror image the way we look at the world. And we try to gauge a rational actor on the basis of the way we would make decisions. And I think that's a big problem. It's one of the reasons that we just missed the fact that Putin was going to invade Ukraine, because they're like, and I talked to so many people about this, and they're like, it would be crazy. Why would they do that? You'd be destructive to their economy. And it's because they don't have the same way of looking at the world as we do. And I think Xi Jinping is exactly that way in terms of our ability to gauge the decisions he's going to make. Unless you kind of begin to walk in his shoes and see the world through his eyes, we're likely to stumble into something just because we try to think about the decisions that he would make or the party would make, using the way we look at the world as a point of reference.
It's really not that far fetched. We saw with zero COVID, the Communist Party was fine locking people up in their apartments, and they didn't care if people starved to death in their apartments. That kind of mass government action is perfectly acceptable to the Chinese Communist Party and would be unthinkable in the West.
Right, and the way that they pursue these types of issues are not the same way that you might see somebody that has true empathy. In other words, you're worrying about the suffering of the people. When they worry about things where people are suffering, it usually has to do with the reaction from the population based on that suffering and what the likelihood is that that reaction goes out of control. So they don't really care about the people themselves or the harm that they cause. It is, will this result in a backlash from society that ends up having the party overthrown? So, everything they do is for a purpose, and certainly they have no empathy for the people. I think that's the piece that I think it would do well for leaders of the free world to understand.
The way you describe the Communist Party leadership basically is like sociopaths.
Well, I mean, it is in a sense. We hear this term all the time that people like to use. They're like a mafia, and I believe that to be true. It is very much a. I mean, look, it's a political party that has one goal in mind, and that's to stay in power. And there is no other calculus that surpasses that. And so everything they do is to stay in power, and they're willing to sacrifice anybody or anything to do that. And so, and that's just not something that you see in the West, or you haven't seen in the West. You're starting to see aspects of that kind of behavior. Particularly, we saw it a lot during COVID. But yeah, I mean, they have a very, and when, more importantly, I think when you start to think in the terms that they do, then you're much more able to predict the actions that they might take.